Hey everybody, welcome back to another video. Today we're going to talk about the best tanks in Blade Xlord and how you should be building your team. So we've got 4 tanks on display today. These are the top 4 tanks that I wanted to talk about. We'll see Meryl, who is the tank that you start with, Redon, who is the highest rated so far, Zed, and Athena, who is a pretty interesting tank in her own right. So let's get into the video. So before we talk about the specific tanks, I want to talk a little bit about party building. So you might have seen that you want to go for all one element when you're building your party, and that's certainly true because there's a lot of buffs that are specific to an element. So if you have all fire units and you have lots of fire weapons, then that's the best way to make your entire party very, very strong. So because of this, you've also might have seen that you should be going for a light party, and that's because there's a color wheel in Blade Xlord where the different elements do more or less damage to each other, and forest, fire, water, and lightning go in a wheel, but light and dark are in their own realm, where light is strong against dark but also weak against dark, and vice versa. So with all the stages having lots of the basic 4 elements in them, then a full light party will have no weaknesses to a lot of stages and just be weak and strong on a dark stage. So that's certainly one way to build your party, but you can also build your party with different roles. So there's attackers, healers, and DPS. And when we look at the actual breakdown of these roles in the game, we have 9 tanks, we actually have 10 healers, and we have 18 damage dealers. So it's way easier to get a damage dealer than it is to get a tank in this game, and I think that's important because sometimes you're going to want to use different parties. For example, when you're farming on auto loop, you might just want a super high damage party that has 4 attackers, but when you're taking on hard content or you're trying to push through the story content without doing a ton of leveling and you're a little under rated for the battle, then you might want a tank and a healer, or just for raid content, whatever we're doing, you might want a tank and a healer. So with that being said, we're going to get into our different tanks, and the first one we're going to talk about is Meryl. So Meryl is your starting tank, and she is a lightning element. She uses a lance, and she's pretty awesome. I haven't checked to see if we're going to get a different version of her, and I really hope we do because she's one of my favorite characters, but we're going to start with her just to give you a comparison of the stats. So at level 90, you can see her stats here, and I'm going to tell you right now that her stats are quite low compared to a lot of other tanks. So for example, her attack is 207, but when we look at Redon, we're going to see his max attack at max level is 265. In even defense, her defense is 100 lower than the highest rated tank. So her stats overall aren't that good, but her skills are pretty decent, which is why she's recommended as a tank. If you can't get something better early on, she's not a bad way to go. So she has a brave skill, which is Ein Jar, and it's a 2 BP cost, which is a good cost, right? So you're gonna be able to use that plenty. It's really easy to use a lot of 2 BP skills over and over in a battle, and this applies damage barrier to your allies, and that's just a really solid tank ability to have. To give you an idea, not every single tank has that. There's some tanks that have damage ones, there's some tanks that have HP regeneration ones for themselves, and then if there's a few tanks that have a barrier, and it's no surprise that those are the top tanks. All give a barrier to the party because that's something that you can use right before a boss uses their big attack. She also has some decent skills. So she has a taunt skill, doesn't do anything else though. She has a damage skill. She has an AoE damage skill that inflicts paralysis. And she also has a big damage skill as well that kind of increases the hate that she has. So This is definitely is like it's an okay skill kit, and it's definitely fine to start off with, but we're eventually going to want to move on to the big boys, to the better tanks, if you're lucky enough to pull someone, especially if you're lucky enough to pull Redon. So Redon, he's actually my tank in my party. He's pretty awesome, and one of the reasons why is because he's got really solid stats. He's got the highest defense out of all the tanks, tied for the highest. He's got one of the highest attacks. His magic defense is decent, and he's got a really solid BP skill, so that's why he's the S-class tank. And he's also light element, so again, if your tank is light element, they're taking less, they don't have very many weaknesses, so it's going to be harder for them to take damage from all the various elemental bosses. So looking at Redon's skills, he has the Alabaster Dragon Corpse, 2 BP cost for his Brave skill, and that's going to not only superbly boost your defense and magic defense, it removes debuffs when your HP is 50% or more. So that's a really nice added bonus, and we don't have to worry about the him doing scorn, because he's got a bunch of other abilities that increase the amount of scorn that he can put on an enemy, including the Steely Knight, which also is a self boost. So when we saw Meryl's ability, hers was able to just put the just kind of taunt your opponent, and his taunt does the same thing, but also gives himself a barrier, which is really nice. He also has Rapid Stinger, which is just a nice attack that also taunts, and then another attack that boosts his defense and his magic defense, and then finally a big AoE that increases with higher defense. So he's just a really solid tank, and there's enough said there. Like, he's going to be able to do more damage than your average tank, and it makes him good for if you're going to auto battle a loop quest that's a little bit higher level than your need to get through. Then he's going to be a really good tank to help you loop on that quest. Moving on, we're going to have Zed next, and Zed is a fire tank. He also uses a lance. They're all using lances, and he's a pretty interesting guy as well. He is good attack. His defense is really solid as well, so he's definitely up there with Redon in terms of stats. I believe he actually has yes, he has more HP than Redon does at his max level, which is nice as well, but his skills aren't going to be quite as good, and he's also a fire element. So his Brave skill again is a barrier, just like Redon, just like Meryl, but he's also going to use it as a taunt. He's got just a regular attack for his first skill. He has an AoE and a taunt on his second skill, and then this is his coolest ability, Drake Blood Barrier. It applies a damage barrier to one ally, so if you know someone's going to take some damage, or if you have a weak character, a weak healer, then you can put a barrier on them, which is really nice. And then finally, his fourth skill is deals 820% physical damage to all enemies, and it's going to increase on how low his HP is, which is kind of a hard stat to put on a tank, or a hard skill to put on a tank. The one other thing that he has that's quite good is resistance to poison and disease. That's a really good auto skill for a tank to have, but otherwise his loadout is just not quite as good as Redon's, and he's also fire, so that makes it a little bit trickier. But if you have a fire party, then he's certainly a good tank to roll with. The final tank that we are going to talk about is Athena. Now, Athena is a very interesting tank because her defense is pretty low compared to the other tanks. So for example, at the max level, Redon and Zed were both at 354 defense, and when she's at max level, she's going to be at 292. So that's like a 60 defense drop off. But you might notice her magic defense is 356. That's the highest out of any tank. So she is a magic tank, which is really great. And she also has the highest attack out of Yep, out of every single tank, she has the highest attack. So she's going to be able to do high attack. She's going to be able to tank magic attacks. But her HP is going to be a little bit lower. Her defense is going to be a little bit lower for that. Otherwise, moving on to her skills, she has a 3 BP cost Brave skill, which is not as good as 2 CP, obviously, or 2 BP. Sorry, I keep thinking of Final Fantasy trading card game and saying CP. So here's the catch. Her BP skill applies a damage barrier to water allies, so you have to use her in a water exclusive party if you want the full value from that, which hurts her value quite a bit. Her regular attack, though, recovers her own HP, which is really solid. Her second attack, Serious Slash, great name, deals 350% physical damage to all enemies in the area, and it's an area effect, and it taunts, so everything taunts so far. And then this next one, High Energy Slash, it's a pretty powerful attack, 640, but also puts a barrier on yourself. And then finally, 8-10% physical damage to an enemy, and it has a 50% chance for a critical hit. So she's a really offensive tank, and that's actually pretty appealing. If you have a water party, then she's really solid. She also has an ability that taunts right at the beginning of every single wave, which is really nice, and her girl power trait is going to increase her resistance to status effects whenever she is protected by a barrier, which she will be because you're going to use her high energy splash attack quite a bit. So she is a really solid tank. She's just so specific. It makes it a lot harder to build her into your party, especially because of her brave ability and that it costs 3 where the other ones cost 2. You want your tanks and healers brave abilities to cost less, because there's some really solid attack abilities that cost more, and it's really nice to save your BP for those other abilities. So when you have a tank ability that costs 3, that's not nearly as ideal as one that would cost less than that, which is pretty straightforward. So going back to our highlight of all of these, you really, if you're gonna pull a tank, and there's more tanks than these ones, these are just the four that I wanted to talk about. Meryl was to compare. She's fine to use for a while. Zed and Redon are going to be your top 2 tanks for sure. If you have those 2, you should be putting them in your party unless you're going for a specific element or something, and then otherwise the other tanks have a bit of a drop off in stats, and there's some exceptions. For example, Bordio has some really high defense, and some of the other tanks have some decent single stats. Bordio and Ars Magna both have damage brave skills, which is kind of nice, but doesn't really help you in loops because they're not casting your brave skills anyway. And then some of the other tanks like Malik and Gordio are able to heal themselves with their skills, which is nice as well, but again, it's just not as useful as a full party buff, because your tank is supposed to be taking damage and your healer's going to heal your tank. So I'd rather my tank be able to protect my whole party, because that's what their job is. So if you're shooting for a tank, if you want to build a balanced party, if you want to take on some of the hard content that will be coming in the future, then you're looking at your best choices for a tank on this screen, and specifically Redon and Zed. And that's going to be it for me. So I really hope that this video was useful to you. Please comment below and let me know if I missed anything, if there's any other tips that you can offer the other viewers. And then please consider liking and subscribing. I really appreciate any sort of support that you guys give. It helps me well, it just helps me feel good and keep making content, which I'm honestly loving to do right now. But the support really pushes me to go harder and make more videos. You can expect a healer video coming up at some point in the near future, and at which point, if there's any specific characters that you want me to do a deeper dive into than just an overview, then by all means, please comment that as well, and I can take a look at that. And otherwise, you're free to go. Get out of here. Thank you so much for watching this video. You can show your support with a like and subscribe, and by checking out my Patreon at patreon.com/Mysidia Gaming. Until next time, keep it real, Mysidians.